June 1944. While the world watched Normandy burn, another hell opened in the Pacific, an island so crucial that its fall would bring fire from the sky directly to Japan's cities. Here, men would fight not for yards of sand but for the power to decide a war. One American soldier would face death with 8 bullets and refuse to leave. One Japanese captain would vanish into the jungle and haunt the victors for over a year. Between them, 16,000 American boys would fall, and an entire garrison of 30,000 Japanese would cease to exist. This is the story of Saipan, the island that changed everything. The humid darkness of June 14, 1944, hung heavy over the Philippine Sea as the largest armada yet assembled in the Pacific War sliced through black waters toward an island most Americans had never heard of, Saipan. The name meant nothing to the Marines packed like sardines below decks, sweating in the tropical heat, checking their rifles for the 100th time, writing letters they hoped would never become their last words to loved ones. But to the admirals and generals orchestrating this massive operation, Saipan meant everything. It was the key that would unlock Japan's throat. Lieutenant General Holland Smith stood on the bridge of his command ship, watching the dark silhouette of the island emerge against the pre-dawn sky. Behind him stretched a fleet of over 800 vessels. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, transports, and landing craft that bobbed like toys in the ocean swell. Aboard these ships were 71,000 American servicemen, the largest invasion force ever assembled in the Pacific theater. Their mission was simple to state but terrifying to contemplate. Seize this 15-mile-long volcanic island from an enemy that considered it sacred homeland and would defend it with suicidal ferocity. The strategic calculus was brutal in its clarity. Since World War I, when Japan had seized Germany's Pacific colonies, Saipan had been Japanese territory. Over 2 decades, Tokyo had poured civilians onto the island, farmers, merchants, fishermen, until nearly 30,000 Japanese colonists called it home. Children had been born here who knew no other land. Schools flew the rising sun, Shinto shrines dotted the hills. To Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, Saipan wasn't some distant outpost. It was Japan itself, the first piece of the homeland under direct threat. Lose Saipan, and American bombers would have a base just 1,300 miles from Tokyo. The home islands would burn. That distance, 1,300 miles, was precisely why Admiral Chester Nimitz and the Joint Chiefs had marked Saipan with blood-red ink on their maps. The new Boeing B-29 Superfortress had the range to reach Japan from the Marianas. With Saipan in American hands, the strategic bombing campaign that would break Japan's will could finally begin. Before that, every bomb dropped on Japan required a perilous journey from China or impossible missions from aircraft carriers. Saipan changed the equation entirely. It was worth any price. The Japanese understood this calculus perfectly. That's why Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded over 30,000 troops defending the island, backed by tanks, artillery, and 2 years of fortification. The volcanic terrain had been transformed into a fortress. Caves honeycombed the cliffs. Concrete pillboxes commanded every beach. Artillery pieces hid in the jungle, registered on every possible landing zone. The defenders weren't just soldiers, they were samurai in modern uniforms, indoctrinated with the ancient code of Bushido that made surrender unthinkable and death in battle the highest honor. As the first gray light touched the horizon on June 15th, the naval bombardment began. The sound was apocalyptic. Battleships hurling shells the size of automobiles, each one screaming through the air before detonating with earth-shattering force. The guns fired so rapidly that individual explosions merged into one continuous thunderclap. Smoke and dust rose in towering columns from the island, obscuring the palm trees and volcanic hills. For 2 hours, the American fleet pounded Saipan with thousands of tons of high explosives. Surely, thought many young Marines, nothing could survive this. They were catastrophically wrong. The first wave of Amtraks, amphibious tractors carrying Marines, churned through the surf toward 8 designated beaches on Saipan's southwestern shore. The Navy had divided them into color-coded sectors: Green Beach, Red Beach, Blue Beach, Yellow Beach. Cheerful names for killing grounds. As the tracked vehicles ground up onto the coral, Japanese guns that had remained silent during the bombardment suddenly roared to life. Machine guns swept the beaches. Mortars dropped from the hills with terrible precision. Artillery shells, pre-registered on every yard of sand, began falling in deadly patterns. Private First Class William Manchester, crouched in an Amtrak with the 29th Marines, would later write of those first moments. The metallic taste of fear, the impossible noise, the way men next to him simply ceased to exist in sprays of red mist. The coral reef that should have been a protective barrier became a trap. Many Amtraks hung up on the sharp edges, presenting stationary targets. Those that made it to shore found themselves in a nightmare landscape where every bush might hide a sniper, every shadow a machine gun nest. The beaches quickly became scenes of organized chaos. Medical corpsmen dragged wounded men behind whatever cover existed. Disabled vehicles, coral outcroppings, the bodies of the dead. Officers screamed orders that were swallowed by explosions. Radios crackled with desperate calls for support, for medics, for ammunition, for help. Some units took 50% casualties in the first hour. Others found themselves pinned down, unable to advance even 10 yards from the waterline. Japanese snipers, hidden in trees or caves, picked off anyone who stood. It took extraordinary courage just to move. But move they did. This was the nature of the American fighting man in 1944. He had been trained, equipped, and conditioned to advance under fire that would have broken earlier generations. Company by company, platoon by platoon, sometimes man by man, the Marines and Army troops of the 27th Infantry Division pushed inland. They used flamethrowers to burn out pillboxes. They threw satchel charges into cave entrances. They called in naval gunfire support that shook the earth. By nightfall on June 15th, 20,000 Americans were ashore, clinging to beachheads that extended barely 1,000 yards inland in some places. The cost was already staggering, 2,000 casualties on the first day. That night brought fresh horrors. Japanese doctrine emphasized night attacks and infiltration, and Sato's men followed these principles with savage determination. In the darkness, Japanese soldiers crept into American lines, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, armed with grenades, bayonets, and suicidal courage. Screams and explosions punctuated the humid night. Marines fought hand-to-hand with enemies they could barely see. Illumination flares cast nightmare shadows across the battlefield. Few men slept, and those who did woke to find their foxhole partners dead beside them. While the ground battle raged, an equally decisive confrontation was unfolding at sea. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had sailed from the Philippines with the mobile fleet, 9 aircraft carriers and supporting vessels, determined to destroy the American invasion force. On June 19th and 20th, in what American pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation was effectively annihilated. American fighters, aided by superior radar and veteran pilots, shot down more than 600 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 100 of their own. 3 Japanese carriers went to the bottom. Japan's carrier force, the sword that had struck Pearl Harbor, was shattered beyond repair. The troops fighting on Saipan would receive no help from the sea or sky. Among those troops advancing slowly across Saipan's hellish terrain was a 21-year-old private from Troy, New York, named Thomas Alexander Baker. Nothing in Baker's background suggested he would become a legend. He had been a textile worker before the war, an ordinary young man from an ordinary working-class family. The Army had assigned him to Company A, 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, the New York National Guard unit that had been federalized and sent to the Pacific. Baker was quiet, well-liked, and unremarkable except for one quality. When the shooting started, something primal and fearless emerged. As June gave way to July, the American advance became a grinding, murderous slog. The Japanese had established defense lines in the island's interior, taking advantage of every hill, every ravine, every bit of high ground. Mount Tapotchau, Saipan's highest peak, became a fortress from which artillery observers directed devastating fire. Sugar-cane fields that had once represented Japanese colonial prosperity now concealed infiltrators and snipers. The Americans advanced with tanks, bulldozers, flamethrowers, and demolition charges, but the cost was measured in burned bodies and shattered lives. Baker's heroism began to manifest in small ways that his fellow soldiers noticed. He volunteered for dangerous patrols. He covered retreats while others pulled back. On July 7th, as his battalion pushed toward the northern tip of the island, Baker's quiet courage would transform into something transcendent. The situation had deteriorated rapidly. Japanese resistance, far from collapsing, had intensified into something apocalyptic. General Saito and Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, the latter the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, now reduced to defending a dying island, had sent a final message to their troops. Unable to win, unable to retreat, they ordered one last attack. Gyokusai, the breaking of the jewel, a mass suicide charge designed to take as many Americans as possible into death with them. July 7th began with an eerie quiet that experienced soldiers recognized as ominous. Then, at dawn, the quiet shattered. Out of the hills came thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians, armed with rifles, swords, bamboo spears, anything that could kill. They came screaming Banzai until their throats bled, came running at machine guns that cut them down in windrows, came stumbling over their own dead to get at the Americans. It was the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War, over 3,000 attackers in a human wave that crashed against American positions like a tsunami of flesh and steel. Baker's battalion was directly in the path. The fighting became primordial, clubbing, stabbing, shooting at point-blank range. The Americans, initially stunned by the ferocity and scale of the assault, rallied and fought with desperate determination. But there were too many attackers coming from too many directions. Positions were overrun. Men fought alone or in small groups, cut off from their units, surrounded by enemies who sought death as eagerly as victory. In this maelstrom, Thomas Baker became something more than human. He established himself with a .50 caliber machine gun and began cutting down the charging Japanese with methodical precision. When his position was flanked, he grabbed a rifle and cleared an enemy position single-handedly, killing multiple attackers. When his company began to fall back under overwhelming pressure, Baker remained behind, covering the retreat with such effective fire that his comrades escaped certain death. Then a mortar round exploded near him, and Baker went down, gravely wounded. The shrapnel had torn through his body in multiple places. Blood soaked his uniform. In the chaos of the retreat, his squadmates tried to carry him, but Baker understood what they did not. Their survival depended on speed, and a wounded man would slow them to the point of suicide. Private Baker made a choice that defines the highest form of human sacrifice. He ordered his comrades to leave him. They refused. He ordered again, with the voice of command that transcends rank when spoken by a man facing death with open eyes. He told them to prop him against a tree, give him his pistol with 8 bullets, and go. He would cover their retreat. He would buy them time. He would not let them die trying to save a man who was already lost. They argued. They begged. But Baker was adamant, and time was a luxury they did not possess. With Japanese attackers closing in, with no choice that wouldn't doom them all, Baker's fellow soldiers made the hardest decision of their lives. They propped their friend against a tree, placed his pistol in his hands, checked that it had 8 rounds, and retreated into the jungle. The last they saw of Thomas Baker, he was calmly checking his weapon, his back against the tree, his face turned toward the enemy. What happened in those final moments no American witnessed. But when Company A returned to that position 3 days later, after the Japanese charge had been broken and the battle had moved on, they found Thomas Baker exactly where they had left him, still propped against the tree, still facing the enemy positions. His pistol lay empty beside him. 8 shell casings were scattered at his feet. In front of his position lay 8 dead Japanese soldiers, each killed by a single pistol shot, each fallen trying to reach the man who refused to die quietly. The image is almost unbearable in its clarity. A dying soldier, alone, in agony, betrayed by his body but not his spirit, carefully aiming and firing 8 times as the enemy closed in, making each bullet count, holding them back those few precious minutes that allowed his friends to escape. Then, the pistol empty, Thomas Alexander Baker had faced death with empty hands and the knowledge that he had saved lives with his sacrifice. For this action, Baker was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. The citation reads cold and official, but beneath the formal language lies a story of courage so pure it seems to belong to mythology rather than history. Baker had not performed his heroism in the heat of sudden action, where adrenaline can make men temporarily superhuman. He had chosen death consciously, calmly, in full knowledge of what he was doing. That is a different category of courage entirely. The Banzai charge, despite its suicidal ferocity, failed. American positions bent but did not break. Superior firepower and defensive discipline turned the charge into a slaughter that killed thousands of Japanese while inflicting heavy but sustainable casualties on the Americans. In the aftermath, General Saito and Admiral Nagumo committed ritual suicide rather than face capture. The organized defense of Saipan was over. But organized defense and resistance are not the same thing. As American forces declared the island secure on July 9, 1944, they were unaware that their occupation would be contested for another 16 months by one of the most remarkable soldiers the Pacific War produced, a man who would become known as the Fox of Saipan. Captain Sakae Oba was 32 years old, a career officer who had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy and served in China before being posted to Saipan. He was not a large man, not particularly imposing in appearance, but he possessed something more valuable than physical prowess. A brilliant tactical mind, absolute determination, and the ability to inspire loyalty in desperate men. When the American victory became inevitable, Oba refused to accept it. As Japanese forces disintegrated around him, he gathered survivors, 46 soldiers, and approximately 200 civilians who had fled into the jungle rather than commit suicide as Japanese propaganda had urged. With this motley band, Oba disappeared into the island's mountainous interior, into caves and valleys the Americans had declared cleared, and began a guerrilla campaign that would frustrate American occupation forces for over a year. Oba's tactics were brilliant in their simplicity and audacity. He never attacked hardened positions or engaged in direct combat against superior forces. Instead, he struck where the Americans were weak: supply depots, isolated patrols, communication lines. He stole food, medicine, and ammunition from American stockpiles. He moved constantly, never sleeping in the same cave twice. He set false trails and elaborate deceptions that sent American patrols on wild goose chases through the jungle. He seemed to know the island better than the Americans who now controlled it, appearing at will and vanishing like smoke. The Americans assigned entire companies to hunt Oba, but he evaded them with almost supernatural skill. His men called him the Fox for his cunning. American troops used less flattering terms but had to admit a grudging respect for an enemy who refused to die. The Japanese civilians under his protection, men, women, and children who had chosen resistance over surrender, survived largely due to Oba's tactical genius and the strict discipline he maintained. He forbade unnecessary killing, recognizing that atrocities would bring overwhelming retaliation. This was not conventional guerrilla warfare, it was survival elevated to an art form. Months passed. The B-29 superfortresses began arriving at Saipan's newly constructed airfields in October 1944. The strategic purpose for which so many had died was being fulfilled. Silver bombers lifted off in formations that darkened the sky, carrying tons of incendiaries toward Japanese cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, cities that had never felt the direct terror of war, began to burn. The firebombing campaigns that would kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians and destroy much of urban Japan had Saipan as their launch point. Thomas Baker's sacrifice and the deaths of 16,000 other American servicemen had purchased this terrible capability. Yet even as B-29s thundered overhead, Captain Oba remained at large, a ghost haunting the Americans' victory. He raided airfield facilities. He ambushed patrols. He survived countless attempts to capture or kill him. His ability to sustain resistance seemed impossible, but he had turned the jungle into an ally and survival into a mission. Finally, in December 1945, with the war long over, with Japan defeated, occupied, and disarmed, American authorities on Saipan faced the absurdity of still conducting combat operations against holdouts. They sent a Japanese officer, a prisoner who had agreed to cooperate, into the jungle with a radio and a message. The war was over, the emperor had surrendered, Continued resistance was pointless and counter to the emperor's wishes. Oba, who had evaded capture for 16 months through skill and determination, agreed to meet. On December 1, 1945, Captain Sakae Oba led his remaining 46 soldiers out of the jungle in full military formation, uniforms as clean as possible, rifles shouldered, and formally surrendered to American forces. He had lost not a single civilian under his protection. His men were gaunt and exhausted but alive. Oba handed over his sword with military precision, a warrior who had kept faith with his duty for over a year beyond any reasonable expectation. The American officers who accepted his surrender did so with obvious respect. Oba was not prosecuted as a war criminal. He had fought honorably under impossible circumstances. After repatriation to Japan, he would live a long life, working as a businessman and occasionally speaking about his experiences. He died in 1992, one of the last living links to the battle that had transformed a tropical island into a symbol of American power and Japanese sacrifice. The story of Saipan is really two stories, inseparably intertwined: Thomas Baker and Sakae Oba, two men who never met but whose lives illuminate different facets of the same terrible human capacity for courage. Baker, dying in minutes but refusing to waste them, spending his last bullets to save his friends. Oba, surviving for months beyond hope, protecting his people through skill and determination. American and Japanese, dead at 21 and living to 72, united by the fact that each, in his own way, refused to surrender what mattered most. The strategic consequences of Saipan's fall rippled across the Pacific War with seismic force. In Tokyo, the imperial cabinet received the news of the island's loss with despair. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, architect of Japan's expansion and the attack on Pearl Harbor, was forced to resign. The political shockwave was profound. For the first time, influential Japanese figures began speaking quietly about the possibility of peace. The idea remained almost unthinkable, crushed beneath decades of militaristic indoctrination and cultural imperatives that made surrender tantamable to national extinction. But the seed had been planted. More immediately, the B-29 campaign begun from Saipan would incinerate Japanese cities with terrifying efficiency. The bombing of Tokyo in March 1945 created a firestorm that killed over 100,000 people in a single night, making it the single deadliest air raid in human history. This was made possible by Saipan. The atomic bombs that would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, ending the war in nuclear fire, were carried by B-29s. One of those B-29s, the Enola Gay, took off from Tinian, Saipan's neighboring island, also captured during the June-July 1944 campaign. The line from the beaches where Thomas Baker fought to the mushroom clouds over Japan is direct and undeniable. Yet the human cost remains staggering and sobering. American casualties on Saipan numbered over 16,000, 3,000 dead, 13,000 wounded. These were not abstract statistics but sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. Men like Baker who would never come home. Men who survived but carried invisible wounds that would haunt them for decades. For many veterans, the Battle of Saipan represented the worst fighting they would ever experience, worse even than the later battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa that would become more famous. The Japanese losses were even more catastrophic and horrifying in their totality. Of the over 30,000 military defenders, fewer than 1,000 survived to be taken prisoner, a casualty rate of over 97%. Thousands of Japanese civilians, trapped between American firepower and their own government's propaganda that Americans would torture and kill prisoners, committed suicide. The cliffs at Saipan's northern edge became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, after hundreds of Japanese families leaped to their deaths rather than face capture. Mothers threw their children off and then jumped after them. The footage captured by American cameramen of these suicides remains among the most disturbing images of the war, a testament to how deeply military propaganda and cultural imperatives can warp human behavior even to the point of self-annihilation. Walking Saipan's beaches today, it's difficult to reconcile the tropical paradise. The clear water, the gentle surf, the palm trees swaying in the breeze, with the hell that consumed this place for 25 days in 1944. Tourists swim where Marines drowned. Luxury hotels stand where aid stations overflowed with screaming wounded. The jungle that once hid Sakae Oba and his fighters is now crisscrossed with hiking trails. Memorials dot the island, some American, some Japanese, all attempting to impose meaning on events that defy easy comprehension. The largest memorial honors not soldiers but the civilian dead. It lists thousands of names. Men, women, children, Japanese colonists who died in the battle or took their own lives rather than survive in defeat. Reading those names, understanding that entire families were extinguished, brings home the comprehensive horror of total war in a way that casualty statistics cannot. War's cruelty extends far beyond the battlefield, consuming the innocent with the same efficiency it destroys armies. Thomas Baker's name is engraved on numerous memorials, both on Saipan and in his hometown of Troy, New York. The Medal of Honor citation is preserved in the National Archives. His story has been told in books, articles, and documentaries, though never as widely as it deserves. But fame was never Baker's goal. He died doing what he believed was right, protecting his friends, buying time with his life, fulfilling a soldier's ultimate duty. That he did so with such profound courage, facing death alone with 8 bullets and the certain knowledge of his fate, elevates his sacrifice to something approaching the sacred. Sakae Oba's story, less known in the West, carries equal power. His was not the final dramatic sacrifice but the long, grinding determination to survive against impossible odds while maintaining honor and protecting those under his command. He could have surrendered any time after July 9, 1944, and no one would have called him a coward. The battle was lost, the cause hopeless. But Oba had internalized the warrior code so deeply that surrender without direct orders was unthinkable. Only when the emperor himself commanded all Japanese forces to lay down their arms did Oba consider his duty fulfilled and resistance honorable to end. The contrast between Baker and Oba illuminates something profound about human nature and the extremes to which it can be pushed. Both men displayed courage far beyond normal human capacity. Both were shaped by cultures that valued duty, honor, and sacrifice above personal survival. Both became legends to their compatriots. Baker as the archetypal American hero who gave all for his brothers in arms, Oba as the samurai who refused to accept defeat even when defeat was total. Yet they fought for nations with fundamentally different war aims and moral standings. The United States, despite its flaws and the moral complexities of total war, fought to stop Japanese aggression and restore sovereignty to conquered peoples. Japan fought to maintain an empire built on brutal conquest and racial ideology. This moral asymmetry cannot be erased by admiration for individual courage. Oba's bravery does not sanctify Imperial Japan's cause any more than Baker's sacrifice whitewashes every American action in the Pacific War. But acknowledging this complexity is essential to honest history. What the Battle of Saipan ultimately demonstrated was the terrible price of total war when waged between industrialized nations with opposing ideologies and the will to see the conflict through to its bitter end. Neither side sought compromise. Neither side could imagine accepting terms that left the enemy's war-making capacity intact. The result was a campaign fought with savage intensity, where quarter was rarely given and survival often required becoming, temporarily, something less than fully human. For the young Americans who stormed those beaches in June 1944, Saipan was supposed to be a brief stopping point on the road to Tokyo. Instead, it became a crucible that tested them beyond anything they had imagined. Many broke under the strain. Combat fatigue, then called shell shock, was epidemic. But most endured, displaying a resilience that still astonishes military historians. They advanced under fire that should have pinned them down indefinitely. They fought in conditions that would have excused surrender. They did this not because they were superhuman but because they believed in their cause, trusted their comrades, and had been trained to a standard that transformed ordinary men into effective soldiers. For the Japanese defenders, Saipan represented the beginning of the end, the moment when the defensive perimeter that was supposed to protect the homeland was irrevocably breached. Every battle afterward would be fought closer to Japan itself. The psychological impact of this loss reverberated through Japanese society and military. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already badly damaged at Midway and Guadalcanal, was shattered beyond repair. The home islands would be next. In the decades since 1944, Saipan has been transformed repeatedly. American military administration gave way to UN trusteeship, then incorporation into the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, a U.S. territory. The island has developed into a tourist destination, attracting visitors who come for beaches and duty-free shopping, largely ignorant of the blood-soaked history beneath their feet. The massive airfields from which B-29s launched death toward Japan now serve civilian aircraft. The hospitals where thousands died of wounds are long demolished. The battlefield itself is gradually reclaimed by nature, coral and vegetation slowly erasing the scars of war. But memory persists. Veterans who survived returned in later years, old men seeking closure or understanding, walking the beaches where they once fought, finding that the island of their nightmares had become beautiful again. Japanese survivors made similar pilgrimages, often meeting their former enemies in reconciliation ceremonies that would have seemed impossible in 1944. These meetings, awkward but genuine, represent a triumph of common humanity over nationalist hatred, a recognition that the young men on both sides were more alike than different, caught in historical forces beyond their control. The children and grandchildren of those who fought ask questions that have no easy answers. Was it worth it? Could the same strategic goals have been achieved with less loss? What does it mean to sacrifice so much for a cause, even a just one? These questions deserve serious consideration, free from cheap patriotism or reflexive anti-war sentiment. The truth is complex. Saipan had to be taken if America was to win the Pacific War decisively. The alternative, a prolonged campaign of island hopping with no base for strategic bombing, would likely have cost even more lives and extended the war by years. Yet acknowledging strategic necessity does not diminish the tragedy of each individual death, each life cut short, each family destroyed. Thomas Baker died on July 7, 1944, at the age of 21, having lived barely long enough to become a man. Everything he might have been, husband, father, worker, citizen, was erased in those final minutes against a tree in the Saipan jungle. His heroism was real and deserving of honor, but it came at a price that can never be repaid. The same is true for the 16,000 other American casualties and the over 30,000 Japanese who died defending Saipan. Each was an individual with hopes and fears and people who loved them, reduced to a statistic in the grinding calculus of total war. Sakae Oba survived, living until 1992 and dying at the age of 82 in his own bed, surrounded by family. His survival feels almost miraculous given the conditions he endured. That he managed to protect 200 civilians for over a year with minimal resources speaks to both his tactical genius and his fundamental humanity. He could have abandoned them, moved faster, survived more easily alone. He chose not to. In its own way, this daily choice to maintain duty and honor without the pressure of immediate combat was as heroic as Baker's final stand. The Battle of Saipan ended in July 1944, but its consequences rippled forward through time, shaping the remainder of the war and the peace that followed. The B-29 campaign it enabled was devastating in its efficiency, destroying Japanese cities and killing hundreds of thousands. The atomic bombs it facilitated ended the war but opened an era of nuclear threat that continues today. The demonstration of American power at Saipan convinced some Japanese leaders that peace was necessary but not enough to overcome military hardliners who would require atomic fire before accepting surrender. In the end, Saipan stands as a monument to both human courage and human tragedy. It showcases what people can endure, what they can sacrifice, what they can achieve when pushed to the edge of existence. But it also demonstrates the horrifying cost of war, the way it consumes lives with industrial efficiency, the grief it leaves in its wake. Every hero's story at Saipan is simultaneously a family's tragedy. Every victory calculation must account for broken bodies and shattered minds. Thomas Baker and Sakae Oba never met, but they are forever linked, two faces of the same war, two examples of extraordinary courage shaped by opposing cultures and causes. Their stories remind us that heroism is not unique to one side, that the enemy also possesses courage and honor, and that recognizing this does not diminish our own heroes but rather deepens our understanding of war's complexity. They also remind us that behind every statistic, every casualty figure, every strategic assessment, are individual human beings who faced death with whatever courage they could muster. The island of Saipan today is peaceful, beautiful, and largely healed from the wounds of 1944. But the memory of what happened there should never fade entirely. Those young men, American and Japanese, who fought and died on its beaches and in its jungles, deserve to be remembered not as abstract symbols, but as real people who faced inhuman circumstances and did their duty as they understood it. Thomas Baker with his 8 bullets, Sakae Oba in his jungle caves, the thousands of others whose names we will never know. They fought Saipan's battle. We owe them the effort of understanding what that meant. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you deep-dive historical documentaries like this every week. Hit that like button to help others discover these forgotten stories that shaped our world. And here's a question for you. Knowing what you now know about both Thomas Baker and Sakae Oba, who do you think showed greater courage? The man who chose to die to save his friends, or the man who chose to survive against impossible odds to protect those under his command? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just dates and battles. It's people just like us, facing choices we hope we'll never have to make.